It's nice to see each one of you this morning, and it's especially a privilege for me to be here and to speak. Cynthia called me, I think this was April or May, and said, when can you, would like for you to speak, when can you do it? This was the first day I could promise that I could be here. So I've thought about this, what I would say, and I've decided to continue to do what I plan to say. It's not directly related to what's happened this week, but it underlies the issues that we feel so keenly this week. So, I never knew my paternal grandfather. He died when my father was 12 years old. But I heard stories about him growing up. The family tradition was that he'd gone to Yale, had roomed with a Rockefeller, had been disillusioned with the displays of wealth that he saw, left Yale and joined the Army, served for a while, and then went back to Iowa where he had family, fell in love with an Iowa farm girl. His family did not approve of this marriage and let him know that, but he married her anyway. He then moved with my grandmother back to Springfield, Massachusetts, not far from here, where his family then resided, and they had a daughter, my Aunt Charlotte, who was quite sickly. The family said, well, we'll take care of her, we'll cover whatever medical bills you have. And they said, we think we're going to go back to Iowa because her maternal grandmother is a midwife. This created a row in the family. There were probably other tensions. And my grandfather changed his name from Donald Hugo Stamp to John Sterling, left and never looked back. The only time that there was any communication between the two branches of the family was when my grandfather died. My grandmother called his brother, who was an accountant in New York City, to let him know his brother died, and he suggested that he wasn't going to help her. My grandmother was fiercely independent, that I do remember quite well. She wasn't about ready to ask for help, and so that ended all conversations. So when I came to Yale, I wanted to know about my grandfather. And with all the free time that I had, I just didn't seem to get around to looking into any of the records. And my very beautiful and dear wife took it upon herself to do a genealogical study and really did a great deal of work. And what she learned was this, that my great-grandmother had lived in Iowa, had originally married a man by the name of Kaner. They owned a number of hotels in Iowa and had done quite well, had several sons and some daughters. He died, Mr. Kaner died, and my great-grandmother married another man by the name of Stamp. They had some children, including the youngest of which was my grandfather, Donald Hugo Stamp. A graduate of Yale Divinity School, this gets to be really interesting, was serving a church where they lived in Iowa and told them, if you want to get into Yale, what you need to do is go to Hotchkiss. This is a brand new prep school in Connecticut, and it's been started as a feeder school for Yale. So two of his older brothers, who were Kaners, did that, went to Yale, graduated from Yale, and were very successful. They married quite well. One became a U.S. representative in Congress from Massachusetts, was unfortunately killed in a plane accident when he was returning from D.C. to Massachusetts. Another became the CEO of the brass button factory in Waterbury. There's a high school named after him in Waterbury, and his picture's in the Waterbury Museum. They did well. My grandfather didn't do quite so well. He did go to Hotchkiss, but he decided not to go back one Christmas break, largely because he was going to be dismissed. He apparently got caught smoking. He did join the Army. He did marry an Iowa girl. They did move back to Springfield, And there was some kind of a row in the family, and he changed his name. And the legend in the family is all we have to go by. He changed his name to John Sterling because he admired John Sterling, who was the personal attorney for John D. Rockefeller, who gave Yale his fortune when he died. And there are all kinds of things named after him, including the Sterling Quadrangle, where the Divinity School stands. So people are always asking me, are you related? Well, not by blood. Now, why have I told you this? Well, suppose I only told you the first half of the story, and I told you that my grandfather went to Yale, when I knew, in fact, that he had not. There's no record that he ever went to Yale. What would you think? Do facts matter? Do records matter? I want to suggest that they do. No matter how much I would prefer the family legends, and I would prefer the family legends, I have to deal with the fact that he never did go to Yale. We live in a world that is struggling with truth. Tom Nichols wrote a book in 2017, The Death of Expertise, in which he chronicled the forces undermining expertise in American society. And in 2021, Jonathan Rauch wrote a book called The Constitution of Truth, in which he pretty much hammers a number of politicians across the board for their efforts to erase the line between truth and falsehood, between what is supportable by data and what is not, by flooding the media with all kinds of false information. So I would say we live in what I call, forgive me for my technical term here, an epistemological crisis. And what I mean by that, you don't have to remember that word, is just how do you know what you know? How do you know what's right, what's wrong? How do you know what's true and what's false? And I'd like to think with you for a few minutes about this through the lens of the fourth gospel. Our text raises the question in a famous narrative that I call the trial of Pilate. I don't call this the trial of Jesus because Jesus knows what's going to happen to him. He's serene, he's calm. Pilate, on the other hand, in this section of John, goes in and out of the Praetorium. That's Herod's palace, which is probably that's a model in Jerusalem. But that's probably where Pilate was when this trial took place. And he goes inside and outside 4 different times, trying to figure out, what am I going to do with this guy? The scene comes to a climax when Herod interrogates Jesus and asks him a third question. Jesus responds, and then Pilate asks the 4th question. So Pilate asked Jesus, so then, are you a king? And Jesus said, well, you say that I'm a king. The reason I was born and the reason I came into this world is so that I could testify to truth. And everyone who belongs to truth hears my voice. Now, Jesus just gave Pilate an out, but also put him in a corner. He gave him an out because politically, Pilate now knows this is no political revolutionary. That's not what this is about. So he doesn't have to worry that he's got a revolutionary on his hands. But he's got a greater moral dilemma because now he has to come to grips with, am I going to side with truth or with falsehood? What am I going to do with someone I know, whom I know is innocent? Interpretations of his question, when Pilate says, so what is truth, vary. You could expect scholars like to disagree. That's why we go into this. We like to argue. So some people say, well, maybe it deals with the philosophical background of skepticism. I don't think the readers of the 4th gospel would understand skepticism in the academy, in the Platonic tradition, or skepticism more broadly any more than if I throw those words out at you that you're going to understand what I'm talking about. I just don't think that. I think it's his way of backhanding what Jesus has said and saying, I really don't want to deal with this. I'm not going to deal with this in a direct way. Now, the fourth gospel operates with a binary. We understand what binaries are. You are for truth or you are not. We tend to think of things in more relative ways, more complex ways. So, for example, in my world, we can talk about the half-life of a science. What do I mean by that? Well, normally half-life refers to the half-life of a quantity in some element. So you could say the half-life of something that's radioactive, when it loses half of its radioactivity, that's the half-life. But then it applies to sciences and to fields of study. And all of us want these half-lives to get shorter and shorter because we want medical breakthroughs. We want advances. We want things to move forward technically because they make our lives easier and because in some cases they may save the lives of some people. This is also true in a field like where I work, in ancient history. So I teach my students that when you deal with ancient history, you can talk about what is certain, what is probable, what is possible, what is improbable, and what is impossible. I used to take students a number of years ago to Israel on a regular basis, and we talk about the historical Jesus, and we visit sites, and I'd say, okay, at each site you're going to vote using that scale. Was Jesus here on this spot where something is said to have happened? So, for example, was Jesus in the city of Capernaum? Yes, I think that's certain. Was Jesus crucified and buried in what today we call the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? I would say that's probable. Was Jesus, or did Jesus deliver the Sermon on the Mount at the Church of the Beatitudes? Well, as beautiful as it is, I think it's improbable that that's the site. But it's a wonderful site to visit, just as a pilgrimage site. Recognizing that we have some limits to what we know is not what I'm talking about. I'm also not talking about, do we have political differences? We can have political differences. And I hope that in this church there are political differences, to be honest. But recognizing the limits of human knowledge is very different from the contemporary effort to erase the line between truth and falsehood, or reality and fiction. That's a very different proposition. On a political level, I fear that we're living in the world that some of us are old enough to have read this going to school, George Orwell's 1984, when he said, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." So a couple of weeks ago, I was watching the news and I saw Vladimir Putin, who was in Beijing with Xi and with the head of India. The three of them were meeting there. And Putin made the statement, "Russia has never invaded another country, nor will we invade another country." And I thought, what a bald-faced lie. I watched all of your troops amassed, not just on one network, but on networks from different countries. The world watched your country invade Ukraine. How can you say that? He's deliberately wanting to blur the line between truth and falsehood, between reality and fiction. And I'd like to say that only happens in Russia. But unfortunately, it's not just Putin who lies for political purposes. It happens in America. Politicians lie about trivial matters like, did it rain at some event or not? And lie about major matters like, did somebody win an election or not? And they tell bald-faced lies in the process. The nonstop lying is an attempt to remove the idea that we share common principles of reality, that we actually want evidence for what we believe. So Michael Hayden, who was a high-ranking official under Presidents Bush and Obama, so nonpartisan, but also four-star general, said, "These are truly uncharted waters for our country. We have in the past argued the values to be applied to objective reality, or occasionally over what objective reality is, but never the existence or relevance of objective reality." And that's what we face today. We face this problem. But politicians are not the only group to undermine truth. The internet and digital age is a major contributor to this. It's a wonderful blessing. And if you're watching online, thank you for joining us. You're an example of that by watching online. We stay in touch with our families. We like to FaceTime with our grandchildren, and I'm sure many of you do the same. There are wonderful blessings, but there were people who realized there's a lot of money to be made in this, and they measured their effectiveness by the clicks rather than by the truth of what they put on their pages. And so we have a lot of problems with fake news. We have the problems with foreign governments intruding into our own elections. The possibilities for sharing also leads sometimes individuals to share information about other people that they don't know whether it's true or not, and they share it anyway to the detriment of the other person. If you don't know something is true, don't share it. Don't like it. Don't forward it. That's spreading at risk of falsehood. Some people have coined the term truthiness. Well, I circulate truthiness. I think that Michael Colbert, some of you obviously have seen this gentleman before on late night television, but he had a way of capturing some of these things very succinctly. And this is what he said about truthiness. He said, "We're not talking about truth. We're talking about something that seems like truth, the truth we want to exist." In other words, my grandfather went to Yale. Now, he didn't, but that's what I claim. That's truthiness. That is not truth. So how do we respond to this? How do we react? The concept of truth is of fundamental importance in the fourth gospel. So let me just consider two statements that get at the heart of this. The first one is in Jesus' farewell address, when he tells the disciples that he has to go away, and they're befuddled by this statement. And Thomas, who is rather bold in quizzing Jesus about his statements, asked how he could know the way. And Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Now, scholars debate, how do these three terms relate? Well, let's not worry about that. The basic idea is that Jesus is the way because he is God's truth to us. He is God's revelation to us. He embodies God and reveals God to us. He's the truth, and that gives us life. He's the way to that. But does this revelation have any moral dimension? Maybe I just believe that Jesus is the truth. Do I have to live my life in any different way? Well, yes, we do. If you think of the heated exchange in John 8 that took place during a Feast of Tabernacles, so there's a modern Sukkot, Jesus leveled a charge against his deniers by saying, "You are of your father the devil and want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning." This is Cain and Abel, obviously. "And does not stand in truth because truth does not exist in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own because he is a liar and the father of lies." This is Genesis 3, the lie to Eve about the impact of eating the fruit. The point is that truth has a moral dimension to it. that I am called not only to believe in Jesus, but to be truthful, to live in truth as one of Jesus's followers. Now, I confess, and I'm sure that I have my own biases, but I'm just appalled that so many people I know who are really good people, can support some individuals who are known as brazen liars. I mean, they're just brazen about it. They make no bones about it. They just lie through their teeth, as we say, repeatedly. I'm also aghast when individuals circulate stories that are slanderous and have no evidence. How can we do this? Why do we want to erase the line between truth and falsehood? Now you might be wondering, why would I use John to address this? Why not use a simple statement like Colossians 3:9, which just says, do not lie to one another? End of story. Because I think we need to understand there's something more profound at stake. It's not just what we do. This is a question of whether we stand with Jesus or not. It's whether we stand with the truth that God reveals in Jesus and feel compelled to represent that in our lives. Now, last night I finished reading the biography of a New Testament scholar by the name of Ernst Lohmeyer. I don't expect any of you to have ever heard of this person before. He lived in the first half of the 20th century, but he had a very interesting life. In 1912, he received his degree and was also ordained. And the final step in his ordination was the delivery of a sermon, which he delivered on December 12th, 1912. And the final words of the sermon were a quote from John 8:32. The truth will set you free. I think that became the leitmotif of his life. After he served on the faculties of Heidelberg and then Breslau, where he was also the president in 1930 and 31. And while he did that, he openly supported, in defiance of the Nazi government, Jewish professors. One famous example of this was, there was a well-known New Testament scholar, Dale will have heard of him, Cynthia will have heard of him, Charles will have heard of him, by the name of Gerhard Kittel, who started this Dictionary of New Testament theology in 10 volumes. It's a huge, massive work. Well, Kittel wrote a book entitled The Jewish Question, in which he said Jews should not have rights, basically. And he had the temerity, or the utter gall, to send a copy of this with a letter requesting the endorsement of Martin Buber, the leading Jewish scholar in Germany at the time. Buber would not. He declined, and he wrote his declination in a letter that was published in a journal. Lohmeyer saw